This story will make you question everything you believe about family, love, and identity. 20 years ago, a little girl disappeared into a cornfield without a trace. Her mother spent 2 decades searching for answers, haunted by whispers in the wind and shadows in the night. And just when she was ready to accept the truth, something impossible happened. A woman identical to her lost daughter appeared at her doorstep, but she had no memory of who she was. The past is about to unravel, and a buried secret will change everything. Who is she? Why has she returned now? And most importantly, what really happened 20 years ago? Watch until the end and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe, because the truth is darker than you think. The evening air was thick with the scent of damp soil and the distant hum of crickets. Sarah Miller stood on the front porch of her farmhouse, her fingers tightening around the edges of an envelope that had appeared out of nowhere. The handwriting on it was oddly familiar, sending a shiver down her spine. For 20 years, she had tried to move on. 20 years of pretending the hole in her heart had been filled with time, with acceptance. But tonight, the past had clawed its way back. She exhaled shakily and turned the envelope over. No return address, just her name, just Sarah. With trembling hands, she opened it. There was only one sentence written on the small, yellowed piece of paper. "She's closer than you think." Her breath hitched. She clutched the note, her pulse pounding in her ears. It was impossible. It had to be a cruel joke. But something deep inside her, something she had buried long ago, whispered that it wasn't. Mark, her husband, walked into the living room just as she entered. His brows furrowed as he noticed the color drained from her face. "Sarah? What's wrong?" She hesitated before handing him the letter. He read it, then looked up at her, his face tightening. "Where did this come from?" "It was on the porch," she murmured. Mark sighed, running a hand over his face. "Sarah, don't do this. Not again." "How can I not?" Her voice wavered. "Who would send this? Why now?" He looked away, his jaw clenched. "It's probably just a prank. Someone knows about what happened and thought it would be funny." She shook her head. "No, this isn't random. This means something." Mark turned to her, his expression hard. "And what if it does? What if it's just another dead end? Another heartbreak?" She swallowed, her throat tight. "I have to know." That night, Sarah barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words repeating in her mind. "She's closer than you think." As the clock struck 3, a distant sound reached her ears, a soft, muffled crying. She sat up, her chest tightening. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but she knew that sound. It was the same sound she had heard the night Emily disappeared. Throwing off the covers, she rushed to the window, pressing her face against the glass. The cornfield stretched into the darkness, the tall stalks swaying gently. The crying had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, a flicker of movement near the barn. Her breath caught. A figure, a shadow standing still, watching. Sarah's hands shook as she grabbed her robe and hurried downstairs. She pushed the screen door open, stepping onto the porch, her heart hammering in her chest. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The wind rustled the corn, but there was no reply. She took slow, cautious steps toward the barn. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, and the heavy wooden door creaked as it swung open. The smell of hay and dust filled her nose as she stepped inside. A dim light from the moon filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. And then she saw it, a silver bracelet lying in the dirt. The bracelet Emily had been wearing the night she vanished. Sarah's knees nearly gave out. She bent down, her fingers trembling as they traced the delicate chain. It was real. It was here. Her chest tightened with a mix of fear and hope. Someone had left it for her to find. Someone wanted her to know that Emily, or someone who knew what happened to her, was still out there. The next morning, she sat at the kitchen table, the bracelet clutched in her hands. Mark entered, his face tired. He hadn't slept either. "You went outside last night, didn't you?" She nodded, placing the bracelet on the table between them. His face paled. Where did you get that? The barn. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Sarah. She leaned forward. Mark, this is Emily's. I know it is. He looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. That doesn't mean she's. I know what it means, she interrupted. I know how impossible it sounds, but I heard something last night. Someone. Mark ran a hand through his hair. Sarah, we have to be careful. If this is real, if someone knows something, we need to figure out who they are before jumping to conclusions. She nodded slowly, gripping the bracelet tighter. Then we start now. She spent the day searching through old boxes, pulling out photographs, newspaper clippings, anything that could give her a clue. But one thing stood out. A family picture taken just weeks before Emily disappeared. Something was wrong with it. The image was slightly blurred around Emily, almost as if she didn't belong there. Sarah's fingers traced the photograph, a chill running down her spine. By evening, a visitor arrived. Their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, stood on the porch, her expression grim. I heard you got a letter, she said quietly. Sarah nodded slowly. How did you? Mrs. Jenkins cut her off. Because I got one too. Years ago. Sarah's breath caught. What did it say? The old woman hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. That your daughter didn't just disappear. She was taken. The words sent a shockwave through Sarah. She gripped the edge of the doorframe. Who sent it? I don't know. But Sarah? Mrs. Jenkins looked around nervously before stepping closer. I know something. Something I should have told you years ago. Sarah's heart pounded. What is it? Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, her voice shaky. The night Emily disappeared, I saw someone in your field. A man. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Who? The old woman shook her head. I never saw his face. But I know one thing. He wasn't a stranger. Sarah stared at her, her mind racing. A familiar figure. Someone they knew. Someone who had been close enough to take Emily without suspicion. That night, she sat in her living room, staring at the bracelet in her hands, replaying Mrs. Jenkins' words over and over. He wasn't a stranger. The thought sent shivers down her spine. What if Emily had never truly been lost? What if she had been hidden, right under their noses? And then, as she sat there in the dim light, another envelope slid under her door. She froze. With trembling hands, she picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a single photograph. Picture of a girl who looked exactly like Emily. But the date on the back was from 10 years ago. Sarah's breath caught. If this was real, if this was truly Emily, then someone had been watching. Someone had been keeping her away. And someone was making sure Sarah never stopped looking. Sarah sat frozen, the photograph trembling in her hands. The edges of the paper felt fragile, worn with time, but the image itself was sharp, undeniable. The girl in the picture was identical to Emily, but the date on the back was 10 years ago. That would mean Emily had been alive a full decade after she disappeared. A decade where Sarah had mourned, had searched, had begged for answers. And all that time, someone had known. Mark entered the room, rubbing his eyes from lack of sleep. His gaze fell to the photograph, and instantly, the exhaustion drained from his face. Where did you get that? Sarah swallowed hard. It was under the door. Someone left it. Mark took a slow step forward, his eyes fixed on the image. His hand hesitated before touching the edge of the photograph. This can't be real. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. You see her, don't you? You see Emily. Mark inhaled sharply, shaking his head as if denying it would make it untrue. Sarah, we don't know what this means. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. It means she was alive 10 years ago. It means she didn't disappear into thin air. It means someone took her and someone kept her away from us. Mark let out a breath, his hands resting on the back of a chair. Who would do that? And why? Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. That's what I intend to find out. Determined, she grabbed her coat and the photograph. I'm going into town. Someone knows something. Mark caught her wrist. Sarah, slow down. If this is real, if she's still out there, we have to be careful. We don't know who we're up against. Sarah pulled away. I've spent 20 years being careful. I need answers, Mark. She left before he could stop her, the cold evening air stinging her skin as she climbed into her truck. She didn't have a clear plan, just a desperate urgency burning inside her. The first place she drove to was the one place where people in town gathered, the small diner on the main street. When she pushed open the door, the familiar chime rang above her. The smell of coffee and grilled food filled the air, but Sarah barely noticed. She approached the counter where an older woman, Betty, was wiping down a tray. Betty had worked at the diner for as long as Sarah could remember. If anyone knew anything about the people in this town, it was her. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before pulling the photograph from her coat pocket and placing it on the counter. Betty's hands froze mid-wipe, her eyes widening as she glanced at it. Sarah leaned in, lowering her voice. Do you recognize her? Betty swallowed, glancing around before picking up the photo. Her hands trembled slightly. Where did you get this? Sarah watched her carefully. You know her, don't you? Betty hesitated, then nodded slowly. She came in here once, maybe 8-9 years ago. Sarah's breath caught. You're sure? Betty nodded, her voice quieter now. I never forget a face, Sarah, especially one like this. Sarah's mind raced. Was she alone? Betty shook her head. She was with a man, older, maybe in his 50s. They sat in the back. She didn't say much, but I remember she kept looking at the door like she was waiting for someone or afraid someone might walk in. Sarah's stomach churned. Did she seem scared? Betty hesitated, then nodded. Not outright, but something was off. Sarah's grip tightened on the counter. Do you remember anything about the man? Betty frowned, trying to recall. He was quiet, kept a hand on her shoulder. He paid in cash and they left fast. I never saw them again. Sarah felt like the air had been sucked from her lungs. She tried to steady herself. Betty, this is important. Do you remember anything else? The older woman thought for a moment, then slowly nodded. She dropped something when she left. I kept it because, well, I had a feeling it mattered. Sarah's heart pounded as Betty reached under the counter and pulled out a small, worn notebook. I never read it. Thought maybe someday, someone would come looking for it. Sarah took the notebook, her hands shaking. Thank you, Betty. She rushed back to her truck, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She flipped the cover open, her eyes scanning the first page. The handwriting was small and neat. She recognized it instantly. It was Emily's. Her pulse roared in her ears as she turned to a random page, her eyes catching the words. I keep dreaming of home, but every time I try to leave, he finds me. He always finds me. Sarah's throat tightened. Her baby girl had been alive, had been trying to come home, and someone had stopped her. She flipped through more pages, each one filled with fragmented thoughts, scribbled words that spoke of confusion and fear. Then one entry made her blood run cold. I don't remember my own name sometimes. He tells me I'm someone else, that I was never Emily. But I know he's lying. I know who I am. I just don't know how to get back. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Who was he? Who had been keeping Emily away and making her forget? And why? A tap on her window made her jump. She turned quickly to see Mark standing outside, his face pale. She rolled down the window. Mark, I found. I know, he interrupted. Sarah, we need to go home. Now. She frowned. What? Why? Mark swallowed hard. Because while you were gone, someone left another letter on our porch. Sarah's blood ran cold. What did it say? Mark opened his fist, revealing a crumpled piece of paper. Only 4 words were written on it. Stop before it's too late. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet as she stared at the note in Mark's hand. The words seemed to pulse, daring her to believe them. Stop before it's too late. The threat was clear, but the deeper message was more terrifying. Someone was watching. Someone knew exactly what she was doing. And worse, they wanted her to stop. Mark's face was drawn tight with worry, his knuckles white as he clenched the paper. "Sarah, we need to think about this. We need to be careful." Sarah barely heard him. Her heart was racing too fast, her thoughts unraveling at the edges. Emily had been alive. Alive. For 10 years after her disappearance. She had been somewhere, kept away, forced to forget who she was. And now, the person responsible was still out there, watching Sarah dig into the past, trying to scare her into stopping. But fear had never been enough to stop a mother. She reached for the note, her fingers brushing against Mark's. "Whoever this is, they know we're close to something." Mark exhaled sharply. "Or they know we're getting too close." Sarah shook her head, determination hardening inside her. "No, Mark. This is exactly why we can't stop." Mark hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Sarah, I know you need answers. I do too. But we don't know who we're dealing with. What if?" She turned to him, eyes blazing. "What if Emily is still out there? What if she's waiting for us to find her?" That silenced him. For a long moment they just stood there, the wind rustling through the trees, the weight of everything pressing down on them. Finally, Mark sighed. "Okay, but we do this carefully." Sarah nodded, tucking the note into her pocket. "We start with the notebook. Emily wrote about someone, him. Someone who controlled her, who made her forget. We need to figure out who he is." They went inside, locking the doors behind them. Sarah spread the notebook out on the kitchen table, the pages delicate with age. Each word felt like a whisper from the past, a glimpse into the life Emily had lived after she vanished. "He tells me my name is Elise, but I know that's not true. I don't know why he's lying. I don't know why he won't let me remember." Sarah's stomach twisted. Mark, she wasn't just taken. She was being made into someone else. Mark leaned over the pages, his brow furrowed. Who would do this? And why? Sarah turned another page, her breath catching at the next entry. "Sometimes I almost believe him. He says my memories are just dreams, that I made them up. But then I hear a voice in my head, calling me Emily. I know that voice. It's hers. But I can't remember her name." Sarah's vision blurred. "She was remembering me," she whispered. Mark swallowed hard. She fought to hold on. Sarah turned another page, her hands shaking. The entries were more fragmented, more desperate. Then, she found something chilling. "He said we had to move again, that people were asking questions. He told me if I tried to leave, I'd regret it, that I'd lose everything. But I don't even know what I have left to lose." Sarah gritted her teeth. Who was this man? Who had the power to make Emily disappear, to keep her hidden, to make people stop asking questions? Mark exhaled slowly. "Sarah, what if it was someone we knew, that sent a bolt of ice through her veins?" She shook her head. "No, that's not possible." But wasn't it? Mrs. Jenkins had said the man in the field wasn't a stranger. Her stomach churned. "We need to go back to Mrs. Jenkins. Maybe she remembers something else." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but let's not do this alone." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark took out his phone. "I'm calling Jane." Sarah's body stiffened at the name. Her sister, the one person who had never wanted to talk about Emily, who had told Sarah to stop searching, to let it go. The one person who, after Emily's disappearance, had drifted away. "Why?" Sarah asked cautiously. Mark met her gaze. "Because Jane knows more than she's ever let on. And I think it's time she tells us why." Sarah swallowed hard, a knot tightening in her chest. She wasn't sure she was ready to face Jane, but deep down she knew Mark was right. As he stepped outside to make the call, Sarah turned back to the notebook. She flipped to the last page, expecting another fragmented entry. But instead, there was something different. An address. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears. She grabbed her phone and quickly typed the location into the map. Her breath caught. The address was only 30 miles away. Her hands shook as she stared at the screen. Was this where Emily had been? Where she had been kept? A sudden crash made her jump. She turned to see the front door swinging open. Mark was standing in the doorway, his face pale. His voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, Jane's gone. Sarah's heart stopped. What do you mean, gone? Mark swallowed. She left town months ago. No one's seen her since. Panic rose in Sarah's chest. And you think that's a coincidence? Mark shook his head. I don't know what to think. Sarah's mind was racing. First the letter, then the photograph. Now Jane vanished. Something was very, very wrong. She grabbed the notebook, shoving it into her bag. We're going to that address. Tonight. Mark hesitated, then nodded. We'll be careful. Sarah met his gaze. We don't have time to be careful. Emily might be there. They left the house, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. As they pulled out onto the empty road, Sarah's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She had spent 20 years searching for her daughter. Tonight, she might finally be about to find her. The road stretched before them, dark and endless, swallowed by the thick mist rolling in from the fields. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Mark sat beside her, silent, his eyes scanning the empty highway as if expecting someone to be following them. The tension between them was thick, unspoken but understood. This wasn't just another lead. This wasn't another dead end. This was real. The address in Emily's notebook was real. And whatever waited for them at the end of this road could finally bring them the truth, or something far worse. Sarah's mind raced with the weight of everything that had unraveled over the past 24 hours. The letter, the bracelet, the photograph, the notebook, the warnings, and now Jane, gone without a trace. Sarah hadn't spoken to her sister in months, and if she was being honest, she had given up trying to bridge the distance between them long ago. But now, something gnawed at her, something she hadn't wanted to believe before. Jane knew something, and maybe she had known all along. Mark's voice cut through the heavy silence. We should have told someone where we're going. Sarah's grip on the wheel tightened. Told who, Mark? The police? They closed this case 20 years ago. What would we even say? He let out a slow breath. I don't know. I just don't like this. Whoever left that letter, whoever's been watching us, they know exactly what we're doing. What if we're walking into something we're not prepared for? Sarah swallowed. Then we face it. Mark glanced at her, concern darkening his features. You really think she might be there? Sarah's voice wavered. I have to believe that. The turnoff for the address appeared out of nowhere, barely visible through the fog. Sarah slowed the car, her stomach twisting as she read the rusted street sign. Willow Creek Road. The road was narrow, flanked by towering trees that bent over it like a tunnel, blocking out the already dim moonlight. Her pulse pounded as she turned onto the path, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Mark shifted uncomfortably. This place looks abandoned. Sarah didn't answer. Her heart was hammering too hard against her ribs. The farther they drove, the denser the trees became, until finally, the road opened into a clearing. And there it was, a house, a large, weathered farmhouse, its wooden frame graying with time, its windows dark and lifeless. The porch sagged slightly, the front steps uneven, as if no one had walked them in years. It looked empty, but Sarah knew better. She cut the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark exhaled. If this is where she was, then who was keeping her here? Sarah reached for the notebook, flipping to the last entry again. The address was scrawled hastily, as if written in a rush. No explanation, no context, just an address. But that alone meant something. Sarah shoved the notebook into her coat pocket. We're going inside. Mark hesitated. Sarah. She was already out of the car, the cold night air biting at her skin. Mark cursed under his breath and followed. The front porch creaked under their weight as they stepped onto it. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Turned. Not locked. She glanced at Mark. His jaw was clenched, his body tense. He gave a slight nod. She pushed the door open. The house smelled of dust and time. The air was thick, untouched. Moonlight streamed through the broken blinds, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. It was silent, too silent. No hum of appliances. No distant creaks of a house settling. just an empty, hollow stillness. Sarah stepped forward, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. "Hello." "Nothing." Mark moved cautiously beside her, his eyes scanning the room. "It's been abandoned for years." But Sarah wasn't convinced. Something felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that they weren't supposed to be here, that they were intruding on something forgotten. She moved through the room slowly, taking in the old furniture covered in dust, the peeling wallpaper, the fireplace lined with photographs. She froze. Photographs. Her hands trembled as she reached for one, her fingers brushing the thin layer of dust covering the frame. It was a picture of a young girl standing in front of a cornfield, smiling. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Emily." Mark stepped closer, peering over her shoulder. "Oh my God." Sarah's fingers tightened around the frame. The picture was recent. Emily wasn't a child in this photo. She was older, a teenager. Mark's voice was tense. "Sarah." She was here. Sarah turned, scanning the room frantically. There were more photographs, some framed, some stacked in piles. All of Emily. Her knees nearly gave out. This wasn't just a place Emily had been. This was where she had lived. Sarah rushed deeper into the house, opening doors, searching for any sign that someone had been here recently. She threw open a door at the end of the hall, her breath hitching at what she saw. A bedroom, small, plain, but lived in. The bed was neatly made, the sheets still holding the faint impression of someone who had slept there. A dresser sat against the wall, a mirror above it. On the nightstand, a book lay open, a pair of reading glasses resting on top. Mark's voice was tight. "Someone's been here." Sarah stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the book's pages. Her heart stopped when she saw what it was. It was Emily's notebook, but not the one Sarah had found. This was different, a second notebook. Her hands shook as she opened it. The first page made her blood run cold. "If someone finds this, it means I didn't make it out." Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps. "No, no, no, no." She flipped through the pages, her vision blurring as she scanned the desperate, hurried writing. "I tried to leave. He wouldn't let me. He says I belong here, that I don't have anywhere else to go. But I know that's a lie. I just don't know how to get out." Sarah's chest ached. Emily had been trapped, held here. Someone had been keeping her here. Mark gritted his teeth. "We need to get out of here. Now." Sarah shook her head. "No. We need to find her." Mark grabbed her arm. "Sarah, listen to me. Whoever did this, they could come back at any moment. We're not safe here." Sarah's heart pounded as she stared at him. "We have to." A noise, a floorboard creaking. Both of them froze. The sound came from upstairs. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears. Mark's eyes met hers, wide and alert. And then, a shadow moved at the top of the stairs. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A silhouette, a figure standing there, motionless, watching. She could barely form the word. "Emily?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak. And then, slowly, it turned and disappeared into the darkness. Sarah's entire body went cold as the shadow disappeared into the darkness at the top of the stairs. Her breath was trapped in her throat, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs so violently she thought it might break through her chest. The house had been silent, abandoned. They had been alone, or at least she had thought they were alone. But now the air was different, heavy, charged with something she couldn't explain. Mark grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "We need to get out of here." Sarah couldn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the spot where the figure had stood just moments ago. "What if it was her?" she whispered back, voice trembling. "What if it was Emily?" Mark clenched his jaw. "And what if it wasn't?" That sent a chill down her spine. She turned to him, her throat dry. "If it was her, she's been waiting for us. She's been trapped here. I'm not leaving her." Mark hesitated, his expression tight with fear. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Okay, but we do this together." Sarah took a shaky breath and turned back toward the staircase. The wood was old, warped with time, creaking under her steps as she slowly ascended. Every sound felt deafening in the suffocating silence. Mark was right behind her, his presence grounding her, but nothing could stop the icy dread clawing at her spine. The upstairs hallway stretched before them, narrow and dim, the only light coming from the slivers of moonlight filtering through the boarded-up windows. The air smelled stale, like dust and something deeper. Something lived in. Sarah could feel it. This place wasn't empty. Not completely. She moved cautiously, her fingers brushing against the peeling wallpaper as she passed the closed doors. 1, 2, 3. Each one held the possibility of something she wasn't ready to face. Then a noise, a whisper, faint, distant. Her breath hitched. She turned to Mark, eyes wide. He had heard it too. It was coming from the last door at the end of the hall. Sarah swallowed hard, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. It was cold under her fingers, sending a jolt through her arm. Slowly, she turned it. The door groaned as it swung open. The room was small, barely furnished. A bed sat against the wall, a single wooden chair beside it. A dresser with a cracked mirror stood opposite. The air felt thick, heavy with something she couldn't name. And then her eyes landed on it. A notebook, sitting on the bed, its pages worn and filled with the same small, precise handwriting she had memorized from Emily's other journal. Sarah took a step forward, her fingers twitching as she reached for it. She flipped it open to the last written page, her pulse hammering as she read the words. I heard someone outside tonight. A car. I know I shouldn't hope, but I do. Maybe this time, someone's finally come for me. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Emily had been here. Mark leaned over, his voice urgent. Look at the date. Sarah's hands shook as she scanned the top of the page. It was from 3 days ago. A sob choked in her throat. She's still alive, she whispered, tears burning her eyes. She's still here. But if she was, where was she now? Sarah turned, scanning the room frantically, searching for any sign of where Emily could have gone. That's when she saw it. The closet door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness between the wooden panels. Sarah's breath caught. She stepped forward, one slow, measured movement at a time. She reached out, hesitating for only a second before pulling the door open. Empty. No, not empty. The back panel was slightly loose, the edges worn, as if someone had moved it. Many times. Sarah's fingers trembled as she pressed against it. The wood shifted. A hidden door. Mark cursed under his breath. Sarah. She didn't answer. She pushed the panel aside, revealing a narrow, dark passageway leading down into the walls of the house. A hidden space, place to hide. Her stomach twisted. Emily had been hiding. Sarah turned back to Mark, her voice urgent. She was afraid of someone. Someone in this house. Mark clenched his jaw. And whoever they were, they might still be here. Sarah swallowed hard, her body tense. We have to go down there. Mark hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but I go first. Sarah didn't argue. Mark took the lead, ducking into the narrow passage, his breath controlled but uneven. Sarah followed closely, her hands pressed against the rough wooden walls to steady herself. The passage was cramped, the air stale and suffocating. They moved slowly, step by step, until they reached the bottom. A small door stood before them, slightly open, leading to another hidden room. Mark pushed it wider. The dim moonlight barely illuminated the space, but Sarah could make out the shape of a small mattress on the floor, pile of books, clothes neatly folded in the corner. And then, a note, pinned to the wall. Sarah rushed forward, her breath catching as she pulled it down. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. I had to leave. I couldn't wait anymore. If you find this, know that I tried. Know that I never stopped remembering. I know who I am. I know the truth now. And I know who took me. Sarah's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the paper, her mind spinning. Emily knew. Mark exhaled. Sarah. What if she's running from them right now? Sarah's chest ached. Emily had been waiting, hoping someone would come for her, but she had run out of time. She had left. And if she knew who had taken her, then that meant. Sarah turned sharply to Mark. She's in danger. Mark nodded. And whoever's been watching us, they know we're getting close. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath. Then we don't stop. We find her. We bring her home. Mark's eyes darkened. And we find out who did this. Sarah nodded. But deep down, she already knew. The answer had been there all along. She just hadn't wanted to see it. The night air outside the farmhouse was thick with tension, pressing down on Sarah's chest like a weight she couldn't lift. She and Mark stood frozen, the note clutched in her trembling fingers. Emily had been here. She had written these words. She had known the truth, known who had taken her, known she was running out of time. Mark was breathing hard beside her, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscles twitching. She left, he murmured, his voice laced with frustration and fear. We were so close. Sarah swallowed hard. She left because she had to, because whoever took her, whoever has been watching us, was closing in. Mark turned to her, eyes dark. Then we're not the only ones looking for her. That realization sent a bolt of dread through Sarah's veins. If Emily had run, that meant she wasn't safe. She was out there, alone, trying to escape someone who had held her captive for 20 years. Someone who was still hunting her. Sarah shook her head violently. No, she couldn't let herself spiral. She had spent too many nights drowning in grief, in hopelessness, in the endless torment of not knowing. But now she had something she hadn't had in 20 years. A lead, a clue, a direction. Sarah straightened, gripping the note tighter. She wouldn't have left without a plan. There has to be something here. Something that tells us where she went. Mark exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face before nodding. Then we search every inch of this place. They moved quickly, tearing through the small hidden room with urgency, overturning books, rifling through drawers, lifting the thin mattress in search of any piece of information that could give them a hint. Sarah's fingers trembled as she flipped through the scattered pages of Emily's notebook, her eyes scanning frantically for anything that stood out. And then, a name, she gasped, gripping the page so tightly it nearly tore. If something happens to me, if I don't make it, find Jane. She knows. She's always known. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Her knees felt weak, the room spinning around her. Jane, her sister. Mark's eyes flickered over the words, his entire body going still. Sarah's voice was hoarse. She knew. Mark exhaled sharply. Sarah. She shoved the notebook at him. She knew, Mark. All these years, she knew. That's why she disappeared. That's why she didn't want me looking. That's why she... Her voice broke. Mark took the book from her hands, his expression unreadable. We don't know the full story yet. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Don't we? She vanished when I started searching again. She told me to let it go. She knew. And now Emily's running, and Jane is nowhere to be found. Mark hesitated. If Jane knew something, she might be in danger too. Sarah's jaw clenched. Or she's the reason Emily has been gone for 20 years. The words felt vile in her mouth, like poison burning her throat. But she couldn't ignore the truth staring her in the face. Jane was involved. Mark rubbed his hands over his face, exhaling through his nose. Then we find her. Sarah nodded, forcing herself to push the emotions aside. We check her old apartment first. Maybe she left something behind. Mark didn't argue. He simply grabbed the notebook, tucked it under his arm, and led the way out of the hidden room. They moved fast, exiting the house without looking back. The road stretched ahead of them, empty and dark, swallowing them whole as they drove toward the city. Sarah's heart was a pounding drum as she stood outside Jane's apartment building, staring up at the darkened windows. She hadn't been here in over a year, hadn't spoken to her sister in even longer. She had tried, countless times, but Jane had never answered, had never returned her calls, had never given her the closure she needed. And now Sarah knew why. Mark shifted beside her, his jaw tight. If she's not here, she has to be... Sarah cut in. She's the only lead we have. Mark sighed but nodded, following as she climbed the steps and knocked hard on the door. No answer. Sarah knocked again, louder. Silence. Her chest tightened. She's not here. Mark ran a hand through his hair. Maybe she left something behind. Sarah reached into her pocket, pulling out the small key Jane had given her years ago. The one she had never used. The one Jane had handed to her in passing, saying, "Just in case." Sarah swallowed. "I have her spare." Mark looked at her, uncertain. "Sarah." "She's my sister," Sarah said. "If she's in trouble, I need to know." She pushed the key into the lock and turned it. The door swung open with a soft creak. The apartment was dark, the air stale. Sarah hesitated before stepping inside, flipping the light switch. The bulb flickered to life, casting a dim glow over the cluttered living room. Papers scattered across the floor, boxes half-packed, a suitcase sitting by the door, partially unzipped. Mark exhaled. She was leaving. Sarah moved forward, her fingers grazing over the papers. Newspaper clippings, printouts, old photographs. And then she saw it. Her breath hitched. Picture of Emily. Not from before she disappeared. No, a recent one. Her fingers shook as she picked it up. She was watching her. Mark leaned over her shoulder. "Sarah, look at this." He pointed to a name scrawled on the edge of one of the papers. "Eleanor." Sarah blinked. "Who's Eleanor?" Mark's expression darkened. "I don't know, but Jane sure as hell did." Sarah's chest ached as she shuffled through more papers, more evidence that Jane had been tracking something, or someone. And then she found it. A letter, sealed, addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she tore it open, unfolding the letter, her eyes scanning the words. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm already gone. I tried to fix this. I tried to undo what was done. But it's bigger than I ever realized. You have to be careful. You're not the only one looking for her. If you find Emily, if you find Eleanor, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I never wanted this." Sarah's breath hitched. Eleanor. The name was written over and over again. And then, at the bottom, Jane's last words. "You were never looking for just one girl. You were looking for two." Sarah's knees nearly gave out. The world spun. Mark grabbed her arm, steadying her, but nothing could ground her now. Two. She had been looking for two. Emily hadn't been alone. She had a sister, and someone had been keeping them apart. Sarah's entire body trembled as she turned to Mark, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were never just looking for Emily." Mark's face was pale. "Then who the hell is Eleanor?" Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps. "I think..." Her voice cracked. "I think she's Emily's twin." Mark went completely still, and in that moment, everything shattered. They hadn't just lost a daughter. They had lost two. The words echoed in Sarah's head, reverberating through her skull like a deafening bell she couldn't silence. We were never just looking for Emily. She could barely comprehend it, could barely force her mind to accept what was staring her in the face. Emily hadn't just disappeared. She hadn't just been taken. She had been separated. There had been two. Twins. Mark was still frozen beside her. His hands clenched into fists, his breath uneven. The realization had shattered something inside him too. For 20 years, they had been mourning a single child, agonizing over a single loss, desperately seeking a single answer. But it had never been just one. It had always been two. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched Jane's letter, her fingers digging into the paper like it might disintegrate if she didn't hold on tight enough. "Mark," she choked out, her throat tight with emotion. "She never told us. She never told me. My own sister knew this, she knew." Mark finally let out a breath, one that came out more like a bitter laugh. "That's why she told you to stop looking. She wasn't afraid you'd find Emily. She was afraid you'd find out the truth." Sarah felt a sharp pang in her chest. Jane had betrayed her in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. But even through the searing betrayal, there was something else, something worse. Jane was gone. She had disappeared, leaving nothing but this confession behind. And that meant something had happened. or someone had made her disappear. Sarah's fingers clenched around the letter. We have to find her. We have to find them both. Mark nodded, but his expression was grim. If Jane ran, it means she was scared, which means whatever she was caught up in, it isn't over. Sarah swallowed hard. We start with the name. She turned back to the stack of papers, rifling through them, searching for anything that could tell them more. Eleanor. If Emily had a twin, where has she been all this time? Mark reached for one of the documents, flipping through it quickly. His face paled. Sarah, look at this. He handed her a faded birth certificate. The ink was smudged, but the names were clear. Baby A. Emily Grace Miller. Baby B. Eleanor Rose Miller. Sarah's hands shook. She was ours. She was ours, and we never even knew. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. How had this happened? How had an entire child been erased from their lives, their memories, their world? Mark was already scanning the documents, flipping through them rapidly. There has to be something here. Someone who knew. Someone who took her. Sarah's mind raced, pieces clicking together with painful force. It was planned. It had to be. There was no record of 2 births. No record of Eleanor. Someone did this on purpose. Mark's jaw tightened. Jane knew. Sarah clenched her fists. And she ran before we could ask her why. Mark exhaled. So where do we go from here? Sarah turned back to the letter, her eyes scanning Jane's last words. You're not the only one looking for her. A chill ran down her spine. Who else wants to find her? Mark hesitated, then flipped open the last few pages of Jane's notebook. His face darkened. There's an address here. Sarah's pulse jumped. Where? Mark turned the paper toward her. It's in the next town over. A medical facility. A private one. Sarah's stomach twisted. What kind of facility? Mark hesitated before answering. Psychiatric. A cold wave of nausea rolled through her. You think? Mark's voice was quiet. I think Eleanor might be there. Sarah sucked in a breath, willing herself to stay steady. Then we don't waste time. They moved fast, gathering everything they could from Jane's apartment. The letter, the birth certificate, the files. Every single piece of evidence Jane had left behind. As they drove through the empty streets toward the address, Sarah couldn't stop the flood of emotions crashing through her. Eleanor, a daughter she had never known. A life stolen before it had even begun. And now, somewhere out there, she was waiting. The facility loomed ahead, a tall, whitewashed building sitting eerily quiet against the night sky. It looked more like a forgotten hospital than an active medical center. The windows dark, the front entrance barely illuminated by a flickering street lamp. Sarah's hands were ice cold as she gripped the steering wheel, staring up at the place that might hold the final missing piece of her life. Mark shifted beside her. How do we do this? Sarah inhaled sharply. We go in. Mark nodded, though his shoulders were tense. We stick together. They stepped out into the cold night, their breath visible in the crisp air. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears as she pushed open the heavy glass door. Inside, the reception area was small, dimly lit, with a single woman sitting behind the desk. She barely glanced up, her glasses perched low on her nose. Visiting hours are over, she muttered. Sarah stepped forward, steadying her voice. I need to see someone. Eleanor Miller. The woman finally looked up. Her face remained unreadable, but something flickered behind her eyes. There's no one here by that name. Sarah's breath hitched. Please. She was admitted here. I know she was. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm sorry, but... Mark cut in, his voice calm but firm. Look again. The woman hesitated, then turned to her computer, typing something quickly. Sarah held her breath, her nails digging into her palms. Then suddenly the woman stopped. Her face paled. She swallowed thickly, looking back at them, this time with something close to fear. You need to leave, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's stomach clenched. She's here, isn't she? The woman shook her head, standing abruptly. I don't know who you are or why you're here, but you shouldn't be. If you value your safety, you'll leave now. Sarah's pulse pounded. Where is she? The woman didn't answer. Instead, she reached for a drawer, pulling out a small piece of paper and sliding it toward Sarah. Take this, she whispered, and don't come back. Sarah hesitated, then took the paper. An address. The woman's voice trembled. Find her before they do. Sarah's breath caught. Who's looking for her? The woman didn't answer. She simply turned away, her hands shaking. Mark pulled Sarah's arm. We need to go. Sarah nodded, stuffing the address into her pocket as they rushed out of the building. The moment they stepped outside, the cold night air hit her like a slap. Mark turned to her. What does it say? Sarah unfolded the paper, her hands trembling as she read the words. And then her heart stopped. It wasn't just an address. It was a name. The name of the person who had signed Eleanor's admittance forms. Sarah's stomach dropped. Her throat tightened, because she knew that name. She knew it better than anyone. And it was the last person she ever expected. Mark read over her shoulder, his breath catching. Sarah, he whispered, voice hoarse. Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, because the name written there, scrawled in ink, was her mother's. Sarah's hands shook as she stared at the name scrawled across the paper. The ink smudged slightly from the pressure of whoever had written it. Her mother. It didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. But there it was, right in front of her, undeniable. A name she had seen thousands of times in birthday cards, in old family documents, in childhood memories that now felt like distant echoes. Mark was staring at it too, his breath uneven. Sarah, your mother. Sarah couldn't speak. Her lungs felt like they had collapsed, her ribs locking in place, trapping the air inside her chest. This wasn't possible. Her mother had been there through everything. The night Emily disappeared, the years of grief, the tears, the comfort, the relentless, aching loss. She had been there, hadn't she? A sickening realization settled over her like a storm cloud. Had she been comforting Sarah, or hiding the truth? Sarah's voice finally broke free, though it was barely a whisper. She signed Eleanor into that place. She's the reason she was there. Mark swallowed, his expression tight. We don't know that for sure. Sarah turned on him, her entire body shaking. Then why is her name on that paper? Why did no one ever tell me I had 2 daughters? Why did Jane know? Why did my own mother know? Mark exhaled sharply. I don't know. But if this is real, if she had anything to do with it, then we need to go to her. Now. Sarah's heart was a thunderous roar in her chest. She's been lying to me this whole time. Mark reached out, gripping her shoulders. Then let's make her tell the truth. The drive to Sarah's childhood home was suffocating. Every mile that passed felt like another weight pressing down on her. Each rotation of the tires dragging her closer to a truth she wasn't ready for. Her mother's house sat at the edge of town, tucked behind a line of oak trees that had stood there since Sarah was a child. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow against the dark. But to Sarah, it looked cold, foreign, deceptive. Mark parked the car, glancing at her. Are you ready for this? Sarah clenched her fists. No, but we're doing it anyway. She climbed out of the car before she could second-guess herself, marching up the steps, her pulse roaring in her ears. She pounded on the door, her knuckles stinging from the force. A long silence. Then, the door creaked open. Her mother stood in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back, her face lined with age but still holding that same familiar softness. But tonight it didn't look like kindness. It looked like something else. Something Sarah had never noticed before. Sarah? Her mother's voice was laced with confusion, but Sarah didn't believe it. She shoved the paper forward. Explain this. Her mother frowned, taking the paper and adjusting her glasses as she read it. The moment her eyes landed on her own name, Sarah saw it. The flicker of recognition. The split second of panic before it was buried beneath carefully crafted control. Her mother exhaled slowly, folding the paper neatly and placing it on the entryway table. Come inside. Sarah's stomach churned. No. Not until you tell me why your name is on that form. Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Sarah, this isn't a conversation we have on the porch. Sarah hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to stay in the open. But Mark touched her arm gently, grounding her. We need to hear her out. Sarah swallowed back the bile rising in her throat and stepped inside. The living room was exactly as she remembered it, untouched by time. The same floral-patterned couch, the same wooden coffee table, the same photographs lining the walls. Pictures of Sarah, of Jane, of Emily, but never Eleanor. Her mother sat in her favorite chair, folding her hands in her lap like she was preparing for a polite conversation. I was wondering when you'd find out. Sarah's breath caught. Not a denial, not confusion, just acceptance. She felt her knees nearly buckle. So it's true. Her mother sighed, looking tired, older than Sarah had ever seen her. Yes. Sarah's vision blurred with tears. How could you let me believe I lost one daughter when I lost two? Her mother inhaled sharply. Because you weren't supposed to know. Sarah's body went cold. What does that mean? Her mother closed her eyes for a long moment, as if choosing her words carefully. You were never supposed to have twins, Sarah. The room tilted. Sarah's stomach lurched. Her voice came out hoarse. What the hell does that mean? Her mother met her gaze, and for the first time in Sarah's life, she saw something dark behind those familiar eyes. Eleanor was never meant to exist. Sarah stumbled back, bile rising in her throat. What are you saying? She was my daughter. Her mother nodded slowly. Yes, but she was also someone else's. Sarah's breath hitched. No, that's impossible. Her mother's gaze didn't waver. It's the truth. Mark's voice was sharp. Explain. Her mother sighed, rubbing her temples. It was an arrangement. A deal made long before you even knew you were pregnant. Sarah's mind was spinning, her pulse hammering. A deal? A deal? For my child. Her mother's lips trembled, but she held firm. I did what I had to do, what I was asked to do. Sarah felt like she was drowning. Who asked you? Her mother exhaled. The man who took Emily. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence that swallowed the room whole. Sarah could barely see straight. The walls felt like they were closing in. You knew him. The whole time you knew who took her. Her mother didn't answer. Sarah let out a choked sound, something between a sob and a scream. And you let it happen? Her mother's face twisted with something close to pain. I didn't have a choice. Sarah's knees finally buckled. She sank onto the couch, her hands shaking violently. You sold my child, she whispered, voice hollow. You sold both of them. Tears slipped down her mother's cheeks. I tried to fix it. Sarah let out a broken laugh. Is that what you tell yourself? Her mother's hands clenched into fists. You think I don't regret it? You think I don't wake up every night hearing their cries? Sarah shot up from the couch. You don't get to feel guilty. You did this. You gave my daughters away. And now one of them is running for her life, and the other. Her voice broke. Her mother reached for her, but Sarah jerked away. Who is he? She demanded. Who took them? Her mother inhaled sharply. I don't know his real name. I only knew him by one. Sarah's stomach clenched. What name? Her mother's voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Blackwell. Mark's eyes darted to Sarah's. Recognition flickered, because that name was the same one written in Emily's notebook. Sarah's breath shuddered out of her lungs, and suddenly she knew. They weren't the only ones searching for Eleanor. Blackwell was looking for her too, and if they didn't find her first, they might never find her at all. Sarah could feel her mother's words sinking into her skin like ice, chilling her from the inside out. Mr. Blackwell, a name that had been hidden in the folds of this nightmare all along. A name that had been scribbled in Emily's notebook, buried in Jane's notes, whispered in the corridors of that psychiatric facility. A name she had never heard before. And yet, somehow, she had always known it was there. Her pulse pounded in her ears, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. She turned to Mark, her mind spinning too fast, too violently. "Blackwell," she choked out. "We have to find him." Mark's jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. "No. First, we find Eleanor. We get to her before he does." Sarah's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. He was right. Eleanor was still out there, somewhere in the dark. Running. Running from Blackwell. Running from the past. Running from them. She turned back to her mother, her vision blurring with fury. "You let this happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You let him take them. You let him erase them from my life." Her mother's eyes were glossy with tears, but Sarah felt nothing for them. "Not now. Not anymore. Sarah," her mother pleaded. "You have to understand." "Understand what?" Sarah snapped, her voice cracking under the weight of everything that had been stolen from her. "That you made a deal with a man who took my daughters? That you stood by and watched as I suffered for 20 years? Knowing the truth the whole time." Her mother's lip trembled. "I was protecting you." Sarah let out a cold, bitter laugh. "From what?" Her mother swallowed, her hands shaking. "From him." Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Sarah's heart clenched. "You knew what he was capable of." Her mother didn't answer. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "What did he do to them?" Her mother squeezed her eyes shut. "I don't know." Sarah's stomach twisted violently. "You don't know? Or you don't want to tell me?" Her mother shook her head. "I never saw them again, Sarah. I only know that Eleanor was meant to be taken. She was never meant to stay." Sarah could hardly breathe. The weight of it all was crushing her, pressing her into the ground. She had spent 20 years mourning one daughter, while another had been living in the shadows, a ghost of a life that had never been hers to have. She couldn't think. She couldn't feel. All she knew was that Eleanor was out there, and if Blackwell was looking for her, it meant they were running out of time. The car sped through the night, the address from the facility clutched in Sarah's trembling fingers. The woman at the desk had given it to her like it was her last chance, like it was the only thing standing between her and losing everything. Mark drove in silence, his grip tight on the wheel, his jaw locked in anger and fear. Sarah could barely think straight. "What if we're too late?" Mark's voice was firm. "We're not." Sarah turned to him, her throat thick with emotion. "She's been alone her entire life. What if?" "We're not too late, Sarah." Mark cut in, his voice sharp. "We can't be." Sarah exhaled shakily, nodding, forcing herself to hold on to hope. They pulled onto the long, winding road that led to the location. The GPS directed them deeper into the countryside, the roads narrowing, the night growing darker. There were no streetlights out here, no signs of life, just the endless stretch of trees, bending in the wind, whispering secrets neither of them could hear. And then, a light, dim, flickering, coming from a small house at the end of the road. Sarah's breath caught. "That's it." Mark slowed the car, his expression dark. "If she's here, we get her and we leave. No hesitation. No questions." Sarah nodded. They stepped out of the car, their feet crunching against the gravel. The house was small, run-down, barely more than a shack. But the light inside, it was hope. Sarah took a deep breath and knocked. Silence. Then, a shuffle. Sarah's heart leapt. She knocked again, harder this time. "Eleanor." Another shuffle. Then the door creaked open just an inch, and Sarah's entire world stopped. A pair of eyes stared at her through the gap. Emily's eyes. But the face wasn't quite the same. It was her. And yet, it wasn't. Sarah's breath caught. "Eleanor." The door opened just a little more. And then, in a voice so fragile, so broken, the girl whispered, "Who are you?" Sarah's heart shattered. She reached out instinctively, but Eleanor flinched back. Sarah's throat tightened. "Eleanor, I'm..." But the words caught in her throat. How could she tell this girl, this stranger who had her daughter's face, that she was her mother? Eleanor's wide, frightened eyes flickered between them. "Why are you here?" Sarah swallowed back her emotions. "We've been looking for you." Eleanor shook her head, stepping back, her breath coming fast. No, no, you shouldn't be here. Mark spoke gently. Eleanor, we just want to help you. Eleanor's body tensed. You don't understand, she whispered. If you found me, it means he's close. Sarah's stomach dropped. Who? Eleanor's lips parted. But before she could answer, a noise. Car engine. Sarah turned sharply, her heart plummeting as headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer. Eleanor's breath hitched. You have to go. Sarah grabbed her arm. We're not leaving you. Eleanor pulled away. You don't get it. He never stopped looking for me. Sarah's pulse was a thunderous roar. Who, Eleanor? Who is he? Eleanor's eyes locked onto hers. Blackwell, she whispered. The headlights grew closer. Sarah's breath came fast and uneven. They weren't just out of time. They had walked straight into a trap. The headlights bore down on them like an unspoken threat, the low hum of an engine vibrating through the night air. Sarah's breath hitched as Eleanor's panicked whisper echoed in her mind. He never stopped looking for me. Mark stepped in front of them instinctively, his body tense, his shoulders squared like a shield. Eleanor's hand was trembling as she clutched the edge of the doorframe, her face pale in the dim glow of the porch light. Sarah's heart pounded. This is it. This is the moment everything breaks. The car slowed, crawling toward them like a predator stalking its prey. The tires crunched over the gravel, and then silence. The engine cut off. The headlights blinked out, plunging them into the oppressive darkness of the night. Sarah's fingers twitched at her sides. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, to grab Eleanor and bolt into the woods, but she couldn't move. The air was thick, suffocating. Then the car door clicked open. A man stepped out. Sarah had never seen him before, and yet, she knew. The moment she laid eyes on him, the moment he moved with slow, deliberate steps, she knew. Blackwell. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself with the presence of someone who didn't need to be. His dark suit was pristine, his hair neatly combed back, his expression unreadable. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't look like someone who had stolen a child, who had erased a life. But monsters never did. Sarah's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Mark stepped closer to her, his body rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. Blackwell stopped a few feet away, his sharp eyes flickering over each of them before settling on Eleanor. A small, almost pleased smile curled on his lips. Found you. Eleanor shrank back. Sarah instinctively stepped in front of her, her chest heaving. Stay away from her. Blackwell tilted his head, as if amused. You don't even know what you're protecting. Sarah's jaw tightened. She's my daughter. Blackwell let out a soft TSK, shaking his head. No, Mrs. Miller. She isn't. The words were a slap to the face. Sarah's stomach twisted violently. What are you talking about? Blackwell took another slow step forward. She was never yours to begin with. Sarah's breath caught. Eleanor's entire body went still. Mark's voice was low and sharp. You're lying. Blackwell's smirk didn't waver. Am I? His eyes flickered back to Eleanor. Tell them, Eleanor. Tell them what you remember. Eleanor's breathing was fast and uneven. I don't. You do? Blackwell cut in smoothly. You've always known, haven't you? Sarah turned to Eleanor, desperation clawing at her throat. Don't listen to him. He's manipulating you. Eleanor swallowed hard, her hands trembling. You aren't Emily, Blackwell said simply. Sarah's vision blurred. Stop. But Eleanor's face had gone pale, her body swaying slightly. What? Blackwell took another step closer. You were never Emily. You were never a Miller. Your parents weren't Mark and Sarah. Sarah couldn't breathe. That's not true. Blackwell turned to her, his expression unreadable. You lost one daughter that night, Mrs. Miller, but the one you found wasn't yours. The world stopped. Sarah's mind spun violently, her knees nearly giving out beneath her. You're lying. Blackwell's gaze never wavered. A mistake was made that night. A mix-up. One child was taken when it should have been the other. His lips curved slightly. You mourned Emily, but Emily was never the one who was supposed to be gone. Sarah's stomach churned. No, that's not possible. Eleanor looked like she was about to collapse. Then who am I? Blackwell's voice was soft. You were meant to be Eleanor Blackwell. Sarah broke. Everything inside her shattered. No! She grabbed Eleanor's shoulders, her eyes wild. That's not true. You're my daughter. You're mine. Eleanor's eyes were filled with pain and confusion. Sarah. Blackwell's voice remained calm. You always knew she was different, didn't you? Even when she was small. The way she never quite fit. The way she always seemed lost. Sarah shook her head violently. She's mine. She's mine. Blackwell exhaled slowly. No, Mrs. Miller. She's mine. Eleanor's hands were shaking. I don't remember. But you do, Blackwell said softly. You remember the house, don't you? The one by the lake. The piano in the corner. The lullaby. Eleanor's breath hitched. Her eyes widened. The lullaby. Sarah's blood ran cold. Eleanor staggered back. No, that's not possible. Blackwell's smile was small. You know it is. Sarah's body felt like it was cracking open. 20 years of grief, of searching, of fighting, for nothing. Eleanor turned to her, tears streaming down her face. Sarah. Sarah grabbed her. You are my daughter. I don't care what he says. You are mine. Eleanor's sob choked her. I don't know who I am. Blackwell's voice was a whisper. Come home. Sarah spun on him. You will never take her from me. Blackwell watched her, unfazed. She was never yours to keep. Sarah's pulse was deafening. I don't care what your papers say. I don't care what happened that night. She is my daughter. You will not take her from me. For the first time, Blackwell's expression shifted. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his gaze. And then a sigh. You fought so hard, Mrs. Miller. Sarah's nails dug into Eleanor's arm. And I will never stop. A long pause. Then softly, you won't have to. Sarah's breath stopped. Blackwell's lips twitched. Emily is alive. The world crashed. Mark stiffened. Sarah felt like her soul had ripped open. What? Blackwell exhaled, tilting his head. Emily, your real daughter. The one who was taken that night. She's alive. Sarah staggered. Where? Blackwell simply smiled. She's closer than you think. Sarah's vision blurred. And then Eleanor gasped. Sarah turned just in time to see her collapse. Eleanor. Mark lunged forward as Sarah fell to the ground beside her. Eleanor's body was shaking violently, her eyes wide with understanding. I remember, Eleanor whispered. Sarah's throat closed. What? Eleanor's voice cracked. I remember everything. Blackwell smiled. And Sarah knew. The nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning.